Well, good morning. It's a beautiful Lord's Day and certainly great to be together, to behold our God, to worship Him, to think of His nature, His attributes, and not just His might and His power, but His loving kindness and grace and truth, and the grace that reaches us and that changes us and transforms us to become like who He is. I want to make just one quick sort of announcement. I'm not sure if this will be included in the announcements to come, so I just wanted to mention it up front. This afternoon, or I guess this evening at 5 o'clock, parents, teens, and siblings are all invited to the Keller's home for a devotion and some singing, and then we might possibly watch a movie or something after, but just wanted to make sure that gets mentioned, that it's not just for teens, but teens and family, siblings, everyone is invited out to that. If you just will bring your own food, and we'll see you at 5 o'clock, but just wanted to mention that up front. This week, we're continuing a series that we've been going through for several weeks now. And last week, we talked about being image bearers of God from Ephesians chapter 4. And as we think about this theme of house united and how we are brought together to bear the likeness of God, our Creator, there were two images that were put forth last Sunday that I thought were both very helpful for me. That we're portraits, that we're pictures, we're paintings of God's goodness, and we are mirror reflections of His glory. That's what we were created to be as the image bearers of God, portraits and mirror reflections of His goodness and glory into the world and back up to Him. And as we think about this portrait and these mirror reflections, what we saw last week was that while we were once marred and shattered by sin, by God's grace, we've been recreated anew to bear His likeness again. And that brings us to chapter 5, where Paul, he continues this same idea, but he uses a slightly different analogy, and it'll be the lens through which we look at this passage this morning. He says in Ephesians 5 and verse 1, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children." So from image bearers of God to imitators of our Father. Have you ever noticed the way that children imitate their parents? I'm not sure how well this will show up. This is a picture of me when I was probably about, I don't know, you could probably tell better than I can, maybe 3 or 4. I'm not good with ages, not even my own. Don't remember those days too well. But if you notice, I'm holding a weed eater. Some people call it a weed hacker. I'm holding a weed eater, and why is it that I'm doing that? Is it because I just thought that weed eaters were just the coolest toys that I'd ever seen? Right? Was that what drew me to that? Oh, it's because that's what I saw my father doing. That's what I saw my dad doing, and I saw my dad mow, and I saw him doing the yard work, and so I saw that, and I said, "That's what I want to do. I want to imitate my father." And that happened in any number of ways. I would slip on his boots, or he'd get home from work and he'd slip his shoes off, and I'd step into those and I'd follow him around. Hopefully not in too much of an annoying kind of way. But I constantly followed in his footsteps, right? I wanted to imitate him. I wanted to be like him. Now, I'm not going to take the time to explain the rest of that picture. You can talk to my parents about those pants and the safety goggles. It is a pretty cool shirt, though. I wish I could find one today. But this is something that children do from a very early age, right? In fact, This is like part of like developmental psychology, but you can see that even in like, actually let's move on from that. You can see it even from a very early age, right? Parents will hold their baby up and they're making faces, and if they frown, the child imitates the frown. If they smile, their face lights up, and there's this kind of mirror imaging that's going on. There's this kind of mimicry and imitation that happens just within a few months. Or maybe even before that, I guess I don't really know. But you see this mirror imitation going on. And that's something that doesn't really go away. As children develop, as they grow up, they continue this imitation, often still of their parents, but then it transfers to other people, to friends, to people that they see. Sometimes it's celebrities or mentors that they look up to. But this idea of imitation is something that sticks with us. And the point is that we are creatures of imitation. We like to think that we are completely authentic to ourselves, that we are entirely self-created. But the truth is, you probably picked up a lot of who you are and what you do from watching other people. We are inevitably and often unconsciously imitating the people around us. And that can be for the better, or that can be for the worse. And Paul's hope for us in this passage is that we will choose to be imitators of God. We'll choose to be imitators of God as beloved children. And I want to zoom in on that phrase for just a moment. What Paul is about to say, the idea of imitation that he is about to lay out, this is not how we gain access to become God's beloved child. This is not how we earn his affection or we earn his love. This is how we live out of that identity that is a beloved child. That we are imitators of God because we are his beloved child. That the God who sent his beloved Son into the world did that so that he could call you and he could call me his beloved child. And as I live out of that identity, as we as a house united live out of that identity as beloved children, we become the imitators of God. And so what I want to do is I want to read through this passage together, and it'll be a bit lengthier of a reading than perhaps what we're used to, but I want us to read the passage together and then go back and ask the question, what does it mean? What does it look like to live out of that identity as a beloved child and to become imitators of God? So beginning in Ephesians 5 and verse 1, we'll read all the way through verse 21. So if you do have your paper Bible with you, you might want to follow along. But as we look, ask yourself that question, what does it look like? What is Paul saying about what it means to be an imitator of God? He says there in verse 1, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among the saints. But let there be no filthy talk, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place. But instead, he says, let there be thanksgiving. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure or covetous, that is, an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you, he says, with empty words, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes on the sons of disobedience. Therefore, do not become partners with them. For he says, at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it's shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore, it says, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, for the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is, and do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery. But be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. All right, so a lengthy read and a lot to unpack there, but at this point we've at least covered the passage. We've at least read every verse. But you notice throughout that section, there's a lot of contrast, right? There's a lot of not this, but this, not this, but this. And what Paul is doing there, he's not so much laying out a kind of moral law code or a kind of checklist of arbitrary rules that we can go through. Instead, what Paul's doing is he's contrasting two ways of being. And I want to emphasize that it's not just about doing, but being. He's talking about a way of being. And here, echoing back to what he said in chapter 4 and verse 17, we can either walk as the Gentiles walk, we can walk in the way of the world, we might say, or we can choose to walk in the way that God walks. We can choose to be imitators of God. And so notice first what it looks like to be imitators of the world. He says in verse 3, but sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among the saints. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead, he says, let there be thanksgiving. And I actually want to start with that last word, thanksgiving. Let there be thanksgiving. What Paul is talking about in this section is a distortion and a corruption of what's meant to be good and holy and right and beautiful. And so it's important that we don't lead only and state only by saying that sex is entirely bad, that it's totally wrong, that everything is wrong with it, and we give off this idea that this is not the way that God intended things to be. No, he says this is something to be thankful for, that it should be viewed as and honored as and valued as a gift that God has given and should be used in the way that the giver intends for us to use it. But what happens is we come along, like with many other things, and we distort it. Through our sin, we shatter the gift that it's supposed to be. And the word immorality here is kind of this all-encompassing word. It refers to just about anything, whether that's fornication or adultery or promiscuity, whatever it is. It's this sort of catch-all term that describes anything that's outside the bounds of using this gift in the way that God intended. And this is something that ran rampant in the ancient world. Ephesus was especially known for it. But most of the major cities of Asia Minor, they had whole temples, whole cults, and not cults in the way that we think of it as sort of these small isolated groups. Cults were what the ancient world functioned on. It was the worship of the gods. And there were whole worshiping of deities that held the distortion of sex up in a way that was totally corrupting and totally corrosive and totally distorting of what God intended it to be. It was pervasive throughout the entire culture and society in the ancient world. And we might say, well, maybe we're not too far off from that. It's interesting, the word immorality here is where we get the word, or the Greek word is porneia, which is where we get the word pornography, which is probably the most destructive and devastating outworking of that in our world today in terms of the number of people that it affects and the lives that it ruins. But this is still a very real and apparent and present problem in our culture today. This isn't something that has gone away. And it's a really sad and devastating thing. And I'll just say this, if that is something that you are struggling with, then please reach out. That battle, or what he describes later as this living in the darkness and living in secrecy, that's not a battle that can be fought alone. That is not a battle that you can fight in isolation. You will be ruined and devastated by it. And you'll ruin your life and you'll ruin the lives of the people around you. But immorality is that kind of catch-all term. And then the other two words kind of expound on that. So impurity, a diluting or a distortion of what's meant to be good and beautiful, and then covetousness. And usually we think about that in terms of the coveting of wealth or material things, but here it's the coveting of another person's body for selfish gratification. And this really, I think, characterizes the kind of life that Paul is describing, this certain way of being, a life where everyone and everything are all means to my own self-serving ends. I think that's what this section is all about. It's a life that is characterized by selfishness, where everyone and everything is about how does it serve my own ends. And Paul says this should not even be named. This kind of stuff should not even be named. It shouldn't even be joked about or talked about in some cruel and crude and casual kind of way. For he says this. He says, for you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure or who is covetous or in other words, an idolater, they have no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. And he says, let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. All right, that's a loaded passage that maybe makes us a little bit uncomfortable. But I want us to see what Paul is saying here. When Paul says this, when he talks about the no inheritance and the wrath of God that comes upon the sons of disobedience, I'm not so sure that he has in mind the final judgment day, although he does talk about that elsewhere, and I am not at all downplaying that. He does speak about that elsewhere, but it seems like what he has in mind is a kind of condensed version of what he talks about in Romans chapter 1. And you remember what the wrath of God was in that passage? He talks about how the wrath of God is poured out on all ungodliness. And the way that wrath comes out is this phrase that comes up over and over again, that God gave them over. God gave them over. God gave them over. And it says God gave them over to the lust of their heart. God gave them over to dishonorable passions. God gave them over to a debased mind. The wrath of God in Romans 1 is about God taking his hands away, as if the clay has become so hardened in the hands of the potter that there is nothing else that the potter can do to work and shape and mold it. And so the potter takes his hands away, and the result of that is ruin. And that's, I think, the life that Paul's describing here. That there's a way of being that so strongly kicks against our own humanity that the only thing that God can do is to give you over to the thing that you think you want most. And while that seems really great, the result is that we end up chasing after the very things that actually rob us of our humanity and what it means to be image bearers of God. It smears the portrait and it shatters that mirror. Or maybe we could think about it this way. Do you remember the story of the prodigal son? There, the father realizes that there's nothing else he can do to win back the heart of his rebellious and disobedient son. And so he gives him over to exactly what he wanted. He gives him his inheritance. He gives him the share of his estate. And what does the son do? He takes the gift, he takes the inheritance, he takes his share of the estate, and he goes out to that distant land and he squanders it with reckless living, or other translations say prodigality, or it's the same word as debauchery that we're going to come across later. He squanders it with this sort of reckless living that is so self-centered, right? And while it seemed great at first, while it seemed like the world was in his hands, it led to ruin. And you remember where he finds himself? He finds himself among the swine, eating the pods that the pigs ate, and no one's giving him anything. The life of my own pursuit of the following after my own desires of finally being unbounded by some kind of moral authority. I'm now free to pursue the passions of my heart. And what does that result in? It dehumanizes this young prodigal son to where he's among the swine. And I think that's why Paul takes this so seriously. And it's not a list of do's and don'ts, but it's this way of being. And there are some ways of being that can really mess up your life. And so he says, do not become partakers with them. And I want to pause for a moment on that thought. What do you think it would mean today to be partakers, or other words say partners with this? We said a moment ago that our culture is surrounded by, or we are surrounded within our culture by these very things, by the lusts of the heart and these dishonorable passions in the debased mind, all these things. What does it look like to be partakers with them? I'm going to suggest that we need to be very careful and cautious about what we allow to enter our mind, about what we watch, about what we listen to, about the people we surround ourselves with, and the kind of conversations that we have. Because remember, we are creatures of imitation. And so let's not be deceived into thinking that doesn't have any impact on us, that doesn't matter, that I'm not affected in any way by becoming partakers in whatever way that might mean. Do not become partakers with them, he says. And so that's what it looks like to walk in the way of the Gentiles, to be imitators of the world. And so I can be a partaker of the divine nature, or I can partake of a nature that corrupts and distorts the divine image that God created me to be. And so the question that we need to ask now is, well, what does it mean to be an imitator of God? And to see that, I think Paul shows us three things. And the first is back in verse 1, where Paul, he says this. He says, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love. Walk in love, he says, as Christ loved and gave himself for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So here's the first thing that Paul says about what it means to be an imitator of God. It means to walk in love. And what I want us to see is that this runs completely opposite to the way of the world. I like the way that one author put it. One writer said that it's a matter of choosing to do the work of somehow altering or getting free of my natural and hardwired default setting, which is to be deeply and literally self-centered and to see and interpret everything through this lens of self. That's the way of the world. Right, the way of the world is this self-centered nature where, at least in some way, we have a natural tendency toward that, to see things only through our lens and to pursue things only that are for ourselves. And it is deceptively liberating, but it's destructively self-centered. And in contrast to a life that is shackled by my own self-centeredness, Paul calls us, or we could say God invites us to step outside of ourselves and to walk in love. And not just love in some abstract, undefined kind of way, but he says, as Christ loved us and gave himself for us. And what that means is that it is a love that is intentional, a love that's purposeful, a love that's sacrificial. Rather than getting and gaining for myself, it's the giving up, the giving over of myself for the sake of others in unglamorous ways, but ways that are unmistakably echoes of the cross of Christ. The message of the cross is the measure of our love. And notice that he adds that this was a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. The idea is that we could say the cross, but really Jesus' whole life was a gift that was offered up to God. And think, how different would our world be if we viewed our lives in that way? That the thoughts that I think, the actions that I take, the way that I treat other people, my whole life, however many years that might be, what if we thought, how can I best package the life that I've been giving to one day give back to God as a gift, knowing that he gave his life for me? That's what it means to walk in love, to love as Christ loved. But then he goes on, and this is the second thing. He says, for at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk therefore as children of light. So here's this second thing, not just walk in love, but walk in light. And this contrast of light and darkness is something we see all throughout the Bible from the very beginning. But this idea of moral darkness, I think of especially in the book of Judges, right? This is where there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, this kind of moral relativism. And that led to what was perhaps the darkest days of Israel's history. And here Paul is talking about, I think, this same kind of moral darkness and disorder in contrast to those who are called to be the lights within it. And notice he says not just that you are in the light, but he said that you are light. You are the light. And so he says, walk as children of light. Walk out of that identity as sons and daughters of the Father of light. For, he says, the fruit of the light consists of that which is good and right and true. And try to discern what the will of the Lord is. And he continues on, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness. Right, so these works of darkness, a life lived in darkness where everyone does what is right in their own eyes, that seems appealing, that seems like a life that's worth living, but he says it turns out it proves unfruitful. It proves unfruitful. It fails to produce anything of real meaning and value and beauty. But on the other hand, walking as children of the light, walking as a people who are not concerned about pleasing ourselves, but pleasing a God who is light and good and holy, well, that brings goodness and truth and righteousness and beauty into our life and into the world around us. And so he says, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. And when Paul says that here, what he means, I don't think he means to go around as this kind of beaming, condescending kind of light that's just shining down, trying to tell everybody that they're wrong. Instead, I think it's two things. I think what Paul is saying is that start just by living out of your identity as children of light, and see what kind of fruit that bears over time. In other words, you live in the light as others around you live in darkness. And over time, the world's going to come to see which of those ways of being actually produces something that's of value and of meaning. And as you do that, as you walk as children of light, contrasted to a world and a life that's lived in darkness, then secondly, show them to the one who is the true source of light. He says it this way, a few verses down, quoting this ancient hymn, "Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Now, that doesn't mean that we have to go around and say those exact words, right? That would probably be pretty strange if we just walked up to somebody and started saying, hey, wake up, arise from the dead, Christ is going to shine on you. But the idea is that we live as children of light, and as we do that, as that bears fruit over time, and the people around us notice that there's goodness and truth to our life that perhaps is lacking in theirs, that we're then able to show them to the true source of light so that they too can thrive in the light of Christ and experience the fruit that we enjoy. And so walk in love, walk in light, but then the last thing he says is this. He says, look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise. And I think the third thing that Paul's getting at here is that as we walk in love and walk in light, the last thing is that we walk in wisdom. And wisdom not so much in this sort of what goes on in our head and sort of this intellectual knowledge, but wisdom in terms of how we thoughtfully conduct our lives. Or I love the word that's used here for look carefully how you walk. The word is walk circumspectly. That's probably not a word we use very much. Walk circumspectly, but you get what that word is getting at, that we pay attention to the kind of life that we live. Take time to step out of yourself for a moment and walk circumspectly so that you examine the kind of life that you're living, that you think about where you're going and the kind of works that you're doing. That you realize that this is of significance, not that my life doesn't matter, that I can simply do what is right in my own eyes, but that it matters greatly. That we take care in the way that we walk. And then he describes how. He says, walk in wisdom, redeeming the time, for the days are evil. Therefore, he says, don't be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is, and do not get drunk with wine, but for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. This phrase, redeeming the time, or making the most of the time is how it's put in the ESV. But this is more than just sticking to your planner or filling up your schedule. When he uses this phrase, redeeming the time, I think what Paul is getting at is that he's saying you have been redeemed. You've been bought back from a way of evil and a way of darkness. And so use your time not in a way that is wasteful and careless, and certainly not in a way that is evil, but instead redeem it. That as you come to know God's will, take the time that was once held in bondage and captive to evil and repurpose it for good. Repurpose it to bring about God's will into the world around you. It reminds me of what one great preacher once said. He said, "I am resolved never to lose a moment in time, but to improve it in the most profitable way I possibly can." That is walking in wisdom. But the other thing he says here at the bottom is that we are to be filled with the Spirit. Filled with the Spirit. And it comes in contrast to this idea of do not get drunk with wine. And that might seem like a pretty odd, kind of strange contrast that Paul illuminates for us here. But I think what Paul's getting at is it's about what we allow to have influence over our lives. We even use that phrase, right? The idea of being under the influence. But the idea is that instead of allowing alcohol to be the thing that has influence over my life, that influences me, my thinking and my behavior in a way that is often volatile and destructive, that leads, he says, to a life of debauchery, he says, instead, be influenced by, be filled with the Spirit. Be influenced by God's will in such a way that it changes the very core of who we are. And I think this is so important to grasp what Paul is trying to get us to see within this passage. When I was a kid, I wanted to do what my dad did, right? I stepped in his shoes. I followed in his footsteps. I wanted to become I wanted to act like him in all the ways that might have meant. But as I got older, and even still today, it's not just that I want to do what he does, I want to become like who he is. I want to have his character, I want to have his nature, I want to be filled with his Spirit. And I think that's what Paul is getting at here. That to be imitators of God is not just that I walk as he walked, but that our very nature becomes like who he is and all of his love and his goodness and his truth. And as we close this morning, and I appreciate your time in this lengthy passage, as we close this morning, I want to just end with how Paul sees that working. He says, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and in hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always for everything to God the Father and the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. I hope at some point we'll return to this in a series or in some other way. But when we read, did this stick out to you at all in the text? He's talking about walking in love and walking in light and walking in wisdom. And then all of a sudden he starts talking about singing. It's like, what does that mean? Well, maybe we could ask, why is it that we sing? Why is it that we come together and we speak to one another and we do what we've done this morning? Why is it that we do that? Well, one answer could be that because our God is worthy, and that's absolutely true. We behold our God, and he is good, and he is holy, and he is all these amazing things, and he deserves our worship. He deserves our praise, and we could do nothing less than fall down on our feet and worship him. He is worthy. Another answer we might give is that we encourage one another. That when we come together and we sing these songs, that it's not just about what we're communicating to God and giving thanks to God our Father, but that it connects us and it brings us together as this house united, where we have this mutual encouragement as we sing and make melody together. And both those things are absolutely true, but there's one other thing that maybe we don't always think about it in this way, and I think it's presently aware in Paul's mind as he writes these words, and that is that we become what we worship. We become what we worship. A parallel passage, Colossians 3:16, says it this way: let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdoms, speaking to one another in these psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. It's this very similar idea. And how is it that that happens? How is it that God's word dwells richly within us? How is it that we be influenced and filled with the Spirit? How is it that we become imitators of God, who is good and holy and just? And the answer is worship. For Paul, it's like there is almost nothing more spiritually formative than when we surround ourselves with the image bearers of God and we speak to one another in these psalms and in the spiritual poetry and these spiritual songs that we lift up to God. There's nothing more formative than that. And I don't know how that works on the level of the psychology that goes into that, in the theology that goes into that, or even just spiritually, what's going on in that moment and when we sing together, but it has a profound effect, and we've seen it. I've seen it. Because to walk in a way that is wise is to live a life that's driven by worship. We become what we worship. We become imitators of God. We're about to sing an invitation song, "Where He Leads, I'll Follow." And it is an invitation to be God's beloved child, to walk in love and to walk in light and to walk in wisdom, to be imitators of our Father. And if we can help you in that way, or whatever we can do for you this morning, we ask that you'll come now as we stand and sing.